At 69 years old, Eleanor made a decision everyone called absolute madness. While her husband, after 4 decades of marriage, demanded in court every single penny of the sprawling estate where they'd lived, Eleanor did the unthinkable. She simply pushed the keys across the mahogany table and walked out, taking nothing but a single suitcase and a peace of mind he would never understand. "You'll regret this when you realize you have nowhere to go," he shouted after her. But what he didn't know was that Eleanor was returning to the only place where she'd truly been happy, an old, forgotten house in a modest suburb that he considered absolute garbage. Stay with me until the end, because you'll discover what happened when Eleanor opened that door after 30 years. What she found hidden within those walls, and the way she transformed the remainder of her life into an empire of affection, left her ex-husband and the entire neighborhood speechless. You're about to see that sometimes letting go of everything is the only way to finally gain what truly matters. The courtroom was much smaller than Eleanor had imagined, but the heavy weight of what was happening there felt suffocating. She sat in a stiff wooden chair that creaked every time she shifted, her hands folded neatly in her lap, trembling slightly despite her best efforts to appear composed. Across the aisle, her husband of 42 years. Arthur sat with his attorney, a slickly dressed man in his early 30s who kept glancing at his smartwatch between whispered strategies. Arthur hadn't looked at her once since they'd entered the room. Not a single time after 4 decades of building a life together, of raising their son, Julian, in the beautiful home they'd purchased. When he was just an infant, Arthur couldn't even meet her gaze. The legal proceedings had been dragging on for 3 agonizing months. 3 months of depositions, financial disclosures, and bitter arguments over who deserved what from a marriage that Arthur had quite suddenly decided was over. He had filed for divorce on her 69th birthday. She had woken up that morning expecting perhaps breakfast in bed or at least a thoughtful card. Instead, she had found divorce papers sitting on the granite kitchen island of their estate right next to her coffee mug, accompanied by a sticky note that simply read, "I need to be free to find myself before my time runs out." Free. As if their entire life together had been some sort of prison. The estate they'd lived in for 35 years was valued at approximately $3.5 million. Arthur wanted it. All of it. His high-priced lawyer argued that since Arthur had been the primary breadwinner throughout their marriage as a highly successful corporate executive, while Eleanor had chosen to stay home to raise Julian, Arthur deserved the lion's share of their accumulated assets. Eleanor's lawyer, Evelyn, was fighting back fiercely, but Eleanor could see in her eyes that it was an uphill battle. The judge looked visibly exhausted by the endless bickering. Eleanor completely understood that feeling. She was exhausted too, exhausted by the resentment, the false accusations, and the way Arthur's attorney kept framing her as a financial burden rather than an equal partner in their life. But more than anything, she was exhausted by the thought of Julian. Their 38-year-old son, who lived in Paris with his wife and 2 young children, was being dragged into this toxic mess. Julian had been calling constantly, begging his parents to try counseling, to remember what they'd once meant to each other. Every phone call broke Eleanor's heart a fraction more because she could hear the raw pain in her son's voice. During a brief recess, Evelyn pulled Eleanor into the hallway. "We can win this fight. We can argue for a 50-50 split. You sacrificed your own career to support his rise. You raised your son. You managed that massive household for decades. You are entitled to half of everything." Eleanor looked through the courthouse window down at the parking lot. Arthur was standing by his luxury car, smoking and laughing on his phone, most likely talking to the much younger girlfriend Eleanor strongly suspected existed, but hadn't bothered to prove. "What will it cost?" Eleanor asked softly. "The fight. What will it cost Julian to watch his parents tear each other to shreds in a courtroom for the next 2 years?" Evelyn fell silent for a long moment. "It will cost him. It will cost everyone a great deal." Eleanor made her decision right then and there, not because she didn't deserve her fair share, not because she believed Arthur was right. She did it because she had one precious thing left that mattered far more than vaulted ceilings and prestigious zip codes. She had her dignity, and she had her relationship with her son. When court resumed, Eleanor did something that made her lawyer gasp out loud. She asked the judge for permission to speak. "Your Honor, I would like to formally renounce my claim to the marital estate and accept a flat settlement of $100,000. I believe this will allow us to close these proceedings immediately and with minimal continued hostility." The courtroom fell dead silent. Evelyn gripped her arm tight. "Eleanor, you can't do this." "I can," Eleanor replied firmly, "and I am." The judge looked down at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and deep respect. "Mrs. Sterling, I need to ensure you fully comprehend what you are agreeing to. You are walking away from a property worth over $3 million in exchange for a fraction of that amount. This is legally binding once the ink dries. I understand perfectly, Your Honor. I am 69 years old. I simply do not have the time or energy to spend my remaining years fighting over material things. I would much rather spend the time I have left building something completely new." She signed the binding documents with trembling hands, but she didn't hesitate for a second. As the session concluded, Arthur stood up. For the first time that entire day, he looked her in the eye. "You'll deeply regret this," he sneered, his voice laced with ice. "When you realize you have nowhere to go and no one to take care of you, you'll regret walking away from everything." Eleanor met his cold gaze with absolute calm. "I'm not walking away from everything, Arthur. I'm walking away from nothing that actually matters. There is a vast difference." She picked up her handbag and walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun. Tucked inside her purse was a key she had been carrying around for 3 months. It was a key to a house she hadn't stepped foot inside in over 3 decades. It was the house where they had lived when Julian was just a baby, a modest 3-bedroom starter home in a quiet working-class suburb about 40 minutes outside the city limits. It was the house they had kept, always meaning to flip and sell it, but somehow never getting around to it. The house that Arthur openly referred to as "that dump" and had completely forgotten even existed. The house that Eleanor had quietly, meticulously kept solely in her name through an obscure trust her late father had established years ago. The drive to Elm Street took 45 minutes through heavy traffic. The houses here were small, mostly well-loved, but incredibly modest. There were chain-link fences instead of towering stone security walls, sedans parked in driveways instead of multi-car garages, and colorful children's toys scattered across front lawns. She pulled her car up to number 42. The house was tiny. A single story, maybe 1,200 square feet, with faded yellow siding that had chipped over the years, and a front porch that leaned heavily to the left. The front yard was a jungle of overgrown weeds. The mailbox was hanging by a single screw, and several windows were obscured by broken shutters. It looked completely abandoned because it was. Eleanor lugged her suitcase up the sagging wooden steps. The key was heavy brass, worn smooth by time. It had been on her keychain since the 1980s. She slid it into the rusty deadbolt. It jammed at first, but with a firm jiggle, it gave way, and the heavy door creaked open. The smell hit her instantly. Stagnant air, thick dust, and the distinct tang of mildew. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, she saw right past the surface decay. She saw the solid hardwood floors buried under years of debris, the wide windows waiting to let in shafts of golden light. This place was real in a profound way that the massive estate had never been. She walked through the empty rooms slowly, the tiny kitchen where she had baked Julian's first birthday cake, the cramped bathroom where she'd given him his bubbly first baths, the bedroom that had been his nursery where the pencil marks measuring his growth were still etched into the wooden doorframe. She reached out and traced those faint lines with a trembling finger. 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, all the way up to 7 years old. The master bedroom was what finally broke her. She sank down onto the dusty floorboards and let the tears fall. This was where they had truly been happy, where they had stayed up late whispering about their dreams. They had been practically broke back then, but they had been joyful. When exactly had that changed? She couldn't pinpoint the exact day. It had happened gradually, like the slow erosion of a cliff face. That first night, Eleanor slept in a cheap sleeping bag on the floor of Julian's old room. There was no electricity yet, no running water, zero comfort. She probably should have been terrified. Instead, as she lay there in the dark, she felt remarkably alive. Eleanor woke up to bright sunlight streaming through the dirty glass. Her aging body protested the hard floor, but she pushed herself up and began digging through the house. In a hallway closet, she found a forgotten cardboard box. Inside was Julian's very first pair of tiny leather walking shoes, a faded photo album from his toddler years, some of her old nursing degree certificates, and a Valentine's Day card from Arthur dated 1986. The card read, "To my stunning wife, every single day with you is a total gift." She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by these artifacts, remembering what it felt like to be 28, terrified of the future, but so deeply in love. A sudden knock at the front door made her jump. Standing on her sagging porch was a woman in her late 60s holding a large foil-covered baking dish. "Hi there, I'm Helen Lynn from right next door. I saw someone moving in yesterday afternoon and thought I'd bring over a welcome casserole." Eleanor just stared at her. When was the last time a neighbor at the estate had actually cooked her a meal? "Thank you so much, that is incredibly kind of you." "Are you renting the place or buying?" Helen asked warmly. "I own it. I actually lived here many years ago, and I'm starting over." Helen's expression instantly softened into a look of deep understanding, completely devoid of pity. "Well then, welcome home. If you need absolutely anything, I'm right over at number 44. After Helen left, Eleanor sat on the floor eating the casserole right out of the dish, looking at that old Valentine's card and those tiny baby shoes. She realized something incredibly profound in that quiet moment. She had spent the last 30 years accumulating expensive things, but somewhere in the middle of all that endless accumulation, she had entirely lost track of what actually mattered. This tiny house still held her son's first wobbly steps on a doorframe. It had decades of pure memory soaked into its drywall. It had neighbors who showed up at your door with warm food. That casserole was the best meal she had eaten in months. 3 days later, Eleanor was sweeping the front porch when Arthur's gleaming BMW pulled up to the curb. He stepped out, looking around in disgust. "So, this is where you ended up." He didn't even bother to say hello. "This is exactly where I chose to be," Eleanor replied smoothly. "Eleanor, this is completely absurd. You are 69 years old. You cannot live in this squalor." "I'm living just fine, Arthur. Look, I spoke to Evelyn. If you come back to your senses, we can revisit the financial settlement." "I am never coming back, Arthur." His face hardened into a familiar scowl. "When you burn through that settlement money, what's your grand plan? Do you honestly think you can survive on Social Security?" Eleanor carefully set down her broom. "I survived raising our child practically alone while you worked 90-hour weeks at the firm. I survived managing our household on your meager starting salary when we couldn't afford groceries. I survived your predictable midlife crisis, your cruel divorce papers, and your new girlfriend who is undoubtedly younger than our own son. I am quite certain I can survive a house that needs a little paint." "There is no girlfriend," he snapped, but his eyes darted away guiltily, right on cue. His phone buzzed loudly in his pocket. The glowing screen on his dashboard lit up with a name, Chloe. "You should probably take that, Arthur," Eleanor said with a tight smile. "Chloe is calling." He got back into his car and sped off. Eleanor stood there, shaking with a sudden rush of satisfaction, but his cruel words did echo in her mind. The settlement money wouldn't last forever if she wasn't careful. What was her actual plan? Helen Lynn appeared at the fence line holding 2 mugs of coffee. Ex-husband? Was it that obvious? Eleanor laughed and soon found herself sitting on the porch, spilling her entire life story to her new neighbor. "You are officially the bravest woman I have ever met," Helen declared when Eleanor finished. "But being brave doesn't mean you have to do the hard work alone. This neighborhood fiercely protects its own. My grandson is a licensed handyman. Mrs. Higgins down the street runs an amazing community garden. The local parish has a great community job board, and I make a killer pot roast every Sunday night." Eleanor looked at her, overwhelmed. "Why are you being so incredibly kind to me?" "I know enough," Helen smiled. "You chose peace over possessions. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." That very afternoon, Eleanor started making calls. She called the utility companies. She called Helen's grandson about fixing the porch. She called Julian in Paris to assure him she was safe and happy. And she called the local community center about enrolling in an introductory pottery class. For the first time in decades, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be in the universe. 6 weeks later, Eleanor had built a beautiful routine. She spent her mornings working on the house alongside Sam, Helen's 25-year-old grandson. She spent her afternoons at the community garden run by Mrs. Higgins. The garden quickly became her ultimate sanctuary. It was filled with neat raised beds of organic vegetables, a humid little greenhouse, composting stations, and a charming tool shed painted a vibrant sky blue. Mrs. Higgins was 73 years old and possessed boundless, infectious energy. "The secret to aging," she told Eleanor one day, "is staying useful. The exact minute you convince yourself you're too old to matter, your body starts dying." Eleanor began showing up at the garden 3 mornings a week. She pulled stubborn weeds, watered the tomatoes, and harvested zucchini. The garden naturally introduced her to wonderful new people. There was David, a quiet military veteran who specialized in growing medicinal herbs. There was Maya, a tired but smiling young mother who brought her twin babies in a double stroller. There was Father Thomas, who meticulously pruned the rose bushes. They all chatted while they got their hands dirty. Those small, seemingly insignificant conversations began to fill a hole inside Eleanor that had been empty for years. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Higgins clapped her hands for attention. "I have an idea. What if we clear out the front section facing the street and create a free community farm stand? Take what you need, leave what you can. Strictly honor system." Over the next 2 weeks, the group transformed the space, erecting a sturdy wooden stand and painting a cheerful welcome sign. Eleanor found herself walking over every single day, not just to pull weeds, but to watch who utilized the stand. She saw single moms, elderly couples on fixed incomes, and shy teenagers stopping by for fresh apples. One humid afternoon, a woman roughly Eleanor's age lingered by the stand, looking incredibly hesitant. "Is it really okay to just take a squash?" she asked nervously. "That is exactly why it's sitting there." Eleanor smiled warmly. They struck up a conversation while Eleanor helped her bag some vegetables. The woman's name was Barbara. She had been tragically widowed 6 months prior and confessed she was struggling to find a reason to get out of bed. "You know what I think you need?" Eleanor said impulsively. "A cooking buddy. Cooking for one is miserable. I live right over at 42 Elm. Come over this Monday evening and we'll figure out what to do with this squash." Barbara showed up on Monday. Then she came back on Wednesday and again on Friday. By the end of their 3rd week, it was an unspoken rule that they cooked dinner together 3 times a week. Soon, other people began dropping in. Helen would bring dessert. Mrs. Higgins would bring fresh salads. David would show up with a giant pot of his famous spicy chili. Maya would bring over spectacular homemade dumplings. Eleanor's tiny house slowly filled up with secondhand furniture she scored at thrift shops. Nothing matched. The chairs were different heights, the plates were different colors, but it was incredibly cheerful. When a dozen people were crammed around her dining table, laughing loudly and passing bowls of warm food, the little house felt infinitely more like a home than the grand estate ever had. One evening, Julian video called her from Paris. "Mom, you're covered in flour." "Are you actually baking?" he asked, his eyes wide. They chatted for an hour. Julian looked visibly relieved to see his mother smiling, her hair messy, surrounded by the chaotic, comforting background noise of a kitchen that was actually being utilized. "He worries about you a lot less these days," Barbara noted as Eleanor hung up the phone. "To be honest, I worry about myself a lot less these days too," Eleanor admitted, wiping flour from her forehead. The massive estate had been undeniably gorgeous, but it had been utterly hollow. This tiny house was cramped, loud, and bursting with life. She had originally thought she was sacrificing everything, but standing there with flour on her apron and genuine friends laughing at her table, Eleanor realized she hadn't sacrificed a single thing of actual value. Sam, the young handyman, had become a permanent fixture in her life. Then one crisp Tuesday morning, he walked up the driveway with an older man trailing behind him. "Miss Eleanor, this is my Uncle William. I remembered you saying you wanted to salvage those original kitchen cabinets instead of trashing them." The man who tipped his baseball cap was probably in his late 60s. He had thick salt and pepper hair, incredibly kind brown eyes, and the calloused hands of a lifelong tradesman. "William Higgins," he introduced himself. "Mrs. Higgins from the garden is my older sister." Eleanor laughed. "So basically, I am being entirely sustained by the extended Higgins-Lynn family tree." "Pretty much." William chuckled. "We cast a wide net." William inspected the sticky, outdated cabinets. "These are solid oak, original to the 1950s build. Great bones. They just need a lot of elbow grease. I could easily teach you how to strip and refinish them if you're not afraid of a little hard work." "You'd teach me to do it myself?" "Why not? It's not rocket science. It just takes patience. They began the project the very next week. William would drive over after finishing his day job and they would tackle the kitchen together. He patiently taught her how to safely apply chemical strippers, how to sand with the grain, and how to rub in the new dark walnut stain. They would work side by side for 2 or 3 hours, and then Eleanor would insist on cooking him dinner. Over plates of pasta, she learned his story. He had lost his wife to cancer 8 years ago. He had 3 fiercely protective grown daughters. He loved obscure jazz music, building custom birdhouses, and telling truly horrific dad jokes. He was incredibly easy to talk to, and even easier to share a comfortable silence with. One evening, about 6 weeks into the great cabinet restoration, they were sitting side by side on Eleanor's newly repaired front porch, sipping iced tea. "Do you know what I genuinely appreciate about you, Eleanor?" William asked softly. "You don't treat me like I'm some fragile antique. My daughters mean well, but they're constantly trying to force me to retire and sit in a recliner. People can worry about you and still respect your autonomy." Eleanor replied thoughtfully. They watched the fireflies blink in the yard. "Can I ask why you walked away from the millions?" William asked. "You didn't have to surrender. You could have taken him to the cleaners. I took exactly the amount I needed to buy my freedom," Eleanor said. "The estate was breathtaking, but it was like living inside a museum exhibit. You couldn't touch anything. Here I have neighbors who check on me. I have friends who cook with me. I have a man who patiently teaches me woodworking that is worth 10 times more to me than imported marble countertops." William looked at her with deep admiration. "You really aren't what I expected. There is nothing tragic about you. You're just a woman who decided to rewrite her own ending, and it is honestly amazing to witness their friendship quickly deepened." William started showing up for the neighborhood dinners and the weekend garden cleanups, offering no particular excuse for being there. Helen teased Eleanor relentlessly about it. "The man is smitten." Helen would sing song, "We are just friends." "Helen," Eleanor would scold her. "Sure, friends, who stare at each other like teenagers at a school dance." One evening, as they finally screwed the last brass handle onto the newly gleaming cabinets, William sighed. "Well, that's it. I'm really going to miss having a built-in excuse to come over here every night." Eleanor wiped her hands on a rag. "William, you never need an excuse. My door is always open to you." He turned to face her, his expression suddenly very serious. "Eleanor, I am a direct man and we are both entirely too old to play games. I would very much like to take you out to a proper dinner, not as a carpenter and a homeowner, not as a teacher and a student, as a man who thoroughly enjoys the company of a beautiful woman." Eleanor felt a flutter in her chest. She hadn't felt in 30 years. "I would really like that." He took her to a quiet, candlelit Italian bistro downtown. Halfway through their meal, William reached across the white tablecloth and gently covered her hand with his. "I want to be clear. I'm not trying to replace your past, and I'm not trying to fix anything. I just think you're an extraordinary person, and I want to keep learning everything about you." Eleanor looked down at his rough, warm hand holding hers. "I want that too." Walking back to her car that night, Eleanor suddenly realized something shocking. She hadn't thought about Arthur or the divorce or the mansion a single time the entire evening. She had her cozy house, her thriving garden, her chosen family, and now, perhaps a chance at a new kind of love. The place she thought would be her sad final stop had magically morphed into a beautiful starting line. The phone call came on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October, 4 months after Eleanor had moved to Elm Street. "Mom, I'm coming home." Julian's voice cracked through the speaker. "The firm is transferring me back to the States. We're packing up the Paris house. We fly back in 3 weeks." Eleanor stood in the middle of the community garden, tears of pure joy streaming down her face. Mrs. Higgins rushed over and wrapped her in a tight hug. "Happy tears, I hope." "The happiest." Eleanor sobbed. "My boy is coming home." But 2 days before Julian's scheduled flight, he called back, sounding incredibly strained. "Mom, Dad called me. He's insisting that Clara, the kids, and I stay at the estate while we house hunt. He said your place is basically a shack and that we wouldn't have any room to breathe." Eleanor's stomach instantly tied itself into cold knots. "What? What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed to discuss it with Clara." "Mom, be honest with me. Can your house realistically fit 2 adults and 2 hyper-toddlers? It's definitely not the estate, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. It's tight. We'd have to share one small bathroom, but this is a home, and you're so welcome here. A long silence stretched over the transatlantic line. Finally, Julian sighed. I'll let you know our plan, Mom. The day of Julian's arrival, Eleanor scrubbed her little house until it practically sparkled. At exactly 5 p.m., a black SUV rental pulled up to the curb. Julian stepped out, followed by Clara, and then the 2 children. They stood on the sidewalk, taking in the sagging porch, the tiny yard, and Eleanor, who was standing there twisting her apron nervously. Then Julian's face broke into a massive beaming smile. Mom, he sprinted up the walkway and hugged her so fiercely he lifted her toes off the concrete. You came here, Eleanor whispered, burying her face in his jacket. Of course I did, Julian said firmly. Dad's place is just a building. This place has you in it. That makes it home. That evening was beautiful. Loud, chaotic perfection. Eleanor cooked a massive feast. The tiny kitchen was shoulder to shoulder. Julian and Clara catching up, the kids coloring furiously on the floor, Helen popping over with a freshly baked pie, and William showing up with 2 bottles of good wine. Later that night, when the kids were finally asleep, Julian and Eleanor sat out on the front porch under the stars. Dad called my cell while we were waiting at baggage claim. Julian admitted quietly. He was furious that we didn't go to the estate. I told him I chose to be where the love is. Eleanor closed her eyes. I'm so sorry to put you in the middle of this. Don't apologize, Mom. Honestly, when you guys first split, I was furious with him, but I was so confused by you. I didn't understand why you just surrendered and walked away with practically nothing. I did it to protect you from a vicious trial, she said softly. I know, I see that now, but Mom, you didn't walk away with nothing. You gave up stuff. You walked away with your sanity, your dignity, and your ability to build something incredibly real. Look at what you've done in 4 months. You've built a whole village around yourself. You are glowing. Meanwhile, Dad is rattling around that massive empty house with his shiny new girlfriend, constantly complaining to me about how empty his life feels. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. So the girlfriend is real. Oh yeah, her name is Chloe. She's 34. And honestly, she's perfectly nice, but they have absolutely zero in common. But that is entirely his bed to lie in. My point is, you won, Mom. You made the bravest choice, and I am so deeply proud to be your son. Eleanor reached out and squeezed his hand. Having you sit on this porch with me means more than all the money in the world. Wherever you are, Julian, that's my home. Through the screen door they could hear Clara softly singing a lullaby to the toddlers. I know it's not much, Eleanor murmured, looking around her modest street. Mom, Julian corrected her, it is literally everything. 6 months after Julian's homecoming, Eleanor stood in her backyard, marveling at the transformation. What had once been a depressing patch of dead weeds was now a vibrant, living oasis. William had helped her expand a massive garden along the back fence. Warm, golden string lights were draped through the branches of the old oak tree. In the center of the yard sat a large stone fire pit surrounded by a chaotic circle of mismatched lawn chairs. Today was the neighborhood's official spring potluck, though in reality the concept had grown far beyond the neighborhood. People were streaming through the side gate carrying foil-covered dishes, coolers of drinks, and picnic blankets. David brought his legendary chili. Barbara carried out 3 loaves of fresh sourdough. Mrs. Higgins brought a massive pasta salad. Julian and Clara were busy setting up folding tables, while little Sophie and Leo chased William around the yard with water guns. Helen was aggressively directing traffic, ensuring all the casseroles were properly categorized. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of purple and orange, David pulled out an acoustic guitar and began to softly strum. Eleanor weaved through the crowd of laughing, eating, joyful people. At one point she stepped away from the noise, leaning against the back fence just to take it all in. This tiny house, this modest, uneven yard, this ragtag family of neighbors and friends. It was everything. You look incredibly happy, Mom, Julian said, appearing beside her and handing her a cup of cider. I am, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. I am genuinely, completely, thoroughly happy. You earned every second of it. I honestly think we should send Dad a thank you card. If he hadn't completely nuked our old life, you never would have found your way to this one." Eleanor smiled wistfully. "I spent 40 years molding myself into the perfect corporate wife Arthur required me to be. I completely forgot how to just be Eleanor. I finally remember who she is." Ironically, the very next morning, Eleanor's cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed Arthur's name. She almost let it go to voicemail, but an odd sense of calm washed over her, and she swiped to answer. "Hello, Arthur? Eleanor, Julian mentioned you're doing quite well." Arthur's voice lacked its usual arrogant bite. He sounded incredibly tired. "I am doing wonderfully, thank you." A heavy pause hung on the line. "I made a massive mistake," he finally blurted out, "with Chloe, with the divorce, with the house. I miss our life together, El. I miss you. I was hoping maybe we could meet for coffee, discuss reconciling. You could move back into the house. We could pretend this past year was just a bad dream." Eleanor felt a wave of profound peace wash over her. She felt no anger, no vindictiveness, just clarity. "Arthur, I genuinely wish you peace and happiness. I really do. But our book closed the morning you left those papers on the counter. I've started writing a brand new book, and I am deeply in love with the story so far. You're living in a dilapidated shack with secondhand furniture." Arthur's old temper flared up. "You cannot sit there and lie to me, saying you prefer that over a multi-million-dollar estate." Eleanor looked around her warm, sunlit kitchen. She looked at the beautiful oak cabinets she and William had painstakingly restored by hand. She looked at the scuffed dining table where she hosted her incredible friends. She looked out the window at the garden that helped feed the people on her street. She looked at the crayon drawings her grandchildren had taped to the refrigerator. "I don't just prefer it, Arthur," she said softly but firmly. "I absolutely cherish it. I love my life, I love my messy little home, and I love the woman I have become. And the absolute truth is, none of this beautiful life would have been possible if you hadn't violently forced me to let go of a life that was slowly suffocating me to death. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you." She ended the call before he could say another word. She set the phone down, her hands steady, her heart lighter than air. She had meant every single syllable. That evening, William came over. Julian and Clara had taken the kids to a local museum, so it was just the two of them. They moved around the tiny kitchen with an effortless, practiced rhythm, cooking dinner together like a couple who had been doing it for decades rather than months. "I love you," William said entirely casually, right as he was aggressively chopping a yellow onion. Eleanor froze, her wooden spoon hovering over a simmering pot of marinara sauce. "Excuse me," William set his knife down and turned to face her, wiping his hands on a towel. "I am 68 years old, Eleanor. I refuse to waste time waiting for a picturesque sunset or a romantic movie moment. I love you. You don't have to say it back right now, or ever, but I needed you to know it." Eleanor slowly placed her spoon on the counter. She stepped across the cramped kitchen and looked up into his kind, crinkling eyes. "I love you too." He kissed her right there, standing between the cutting board full of onions and the bubbling pot of sauce. It lacked the wild, desperate urgency of young love. It was infinitely better. It was the grounded, profound kiss of two people who had survived enough heartbreak to know exactly what a true gift looked like. Later that night, as they sat side by side on the porch swing, William's hand resting warmly over hers, Eleanor reflected on her unbelievable journey. From the sterile, terrifying courtroom to this creaky wooden porch, from signing away her fortune to watching her grandchildren run through her sprinklers. She was pushing 70. She lived in a cramped house, budgeted carefully on a fixed income, wore thrifted sweaters, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and owned chairs that didn't match. And yet, she had never been wealthier, because true wealth was love. It was a community that showed up when you called. It was a fierce sense of purpose. It was a family that chose to be near you out of genuine affection, not financial obligation. It was a garden that nourished people. It was the rough calluses on her hands from learning new skills. It was the unwavering confidence earned by surviving the unimaginable. The sprawling estate had been an impressive monument, but this tiny house was a home. She had learned the hard way that sometimes the place you think is your final tragic stop is actually the exact starting line you needed all along. Sometimes losing everything you thought mattered is the universe's only way of handing you what you were actually meant to hold. The massive mansion she had been terrified to lose had actually been a gilded cage, and the run-down shack she had been terrified to move into had been the key to her freedom. Eleanor had learned all of this at 69 years old, but the most vital lesson of all was this: it is never ever too late. It is never too late to start entirely over. It is never too late to learn a new skill, to find a new community, to discover your purpose, or to fall deeply in love. It is never too late to finally become the person you were always destined to be. Society will constantly lie to you. People will doubt your choices. They will call you foolish, naive, or crazy. They will command you to act your age, to settle for the mundane, to desperately cling to whatever prestige you have left. But you do not have to listen. You can choose a different path. You can confidently walk away from the cold mansion and walk boldly toward the warm little house. You can trade sterile marble floors for a table full of mismatched chairs and loud laughter. You can willingly surrender the need to be impressive and instead choose to be authentic. You can choose inner peace over endless possessions and deep connection over shallow comfort. And you can do it at 50, 60, 70, or 90 years old. Because as long as you have breath in your lungs, it is never too late to reclaim the narrative of your own life. If this story resonated with your heart, please drop down into the comments and leave just one single word: resilience, courage, faith, strength, hope. Whatever word best captures how this journey spoke to your soul. Because sometimes, a single word is all it takes to remind someone else that they are not walking their path alone.